theories of how they think RPGs work and what elements they think are core and important to RPGs. And I kind of realized that there's a way I was already looking at it that was kind of parallel to the way other people seem to look at it, but was just slightly different.
Okay.
So I decided to try to commit those ideas down to paper and choose words to assign to those ideas. The biggest thing, the two biggest differences is I have this concept of immersion that I think is important to RPGs and entertainment in general, and I think that's a core element that a lot of people see and care about. And the concept of how agency is important to immersion and causality is important. The idea that you can act upon things and things react. I think that's important. But the two things were maybe a little different is this idea of depiction, which is the way I understand the story of the game. It's not necessarily narrativism. It's not necessarily about the structure of the narrative and the desire to create a satisfying and well-structured narrative. It's more about just depicting events and characters and settings. And the narrative structure is sort of a consequence of what you decide to depict and how you decide to depict it. So, again, rather than narrative, I choose depiction, which is a slightly broader idea of game story, because it isn't about necessarily trying to tell a story. It's just about, again, events, characters, and setting. And then the other element that's different is I wanted to dive into this concept of digestion, because I feel like there's a very consumptive nature to people playing games. And I think that consumptive nature gets overlooked a lot when we try to describe what people are looking for in games. Like, they're looking for, meatiness in the game mechanics, or they're looking for meatiness in the story details, or they're looking for... It's like really what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically consume and eat the game in a mental way. And all these different elements like the crunchy game mechanics or the story details or, simulationist aspects of, believing that the world is real because it has all these little descriptive details that make it feel like it's a living universe. These are all elements of, digestion, the things that they want to consume in their primary, interaction with the game. So, just to break it down more specifically, I felt like when people get into digestion, it's kind of like making a meal for them. And, first, digestion is broken into scope, which is the elements that are in and out of play, which is like flavors in a dish. So this could be related to what's in the depiction of the story. This could be related to the game mechanics that are being used. So it's just the scope of the game. The game's level of detail, which is similar to how crunchy a game is, both mechanic and story-wise, and that's like how sharp it is. And people have different desire levels for how sharp they want a game to be, so that's how much detail they want. And they want detail in different areas. They want details in the depiction side of things. They want details in the immersion side of things with the reaction and the believability, but they want a lot of detail. Some people don't want any detail because they want a very smooth, creamy, fast experience. And then I feel like the last element that's important to everyone who plays RPGs for the most part, except for maybe, some railroady GMs, I guess. The last element of digestion is discovery, and which is, your sense of novelty of, I've never seen this before, or this is new, or this is very awesome and exactly what I want, but it's a new experience in some way. It's not a complete repeat of something I've done before. And I feel like this idea of depiction, immersion, and digestion is a very broad way of looking at games that isn't necessarily presumptive about what games are made up of, and not focused on, the narrative qualities of the game necessarily, or that those are just elements that are tied to these bigger ideas. And the other thing that I like about this is it makes game mechanics and story mechanics and simulationist mechanics, it makes them a way to satisfy these desires of depiction, immersion, and digestion, rather than being the thing that the game is itself. They're more just modes and tools and media of the game to satisfy these three ideas. And so that's what I like about looking at it this way, is that I'm less tied down to the shape of the game and more tied down and more interested in just the bigger purpose of the game. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Okay, I want to pull it apart into a couple places. First has to do with kind of the content of the conversation. Do you want me to talk at all about how I think this relates to anything that I've said or written about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I think you've run into one of the most common issues regarding stuff I've written. One of the word narrativism, just everyone went bonkers with their literary 101 training and started talking about story structure. Okay, it has to have the structure of a story, like I learned in lit class. I never said anything of the kind. So everything you talked about with the story being an emergent property, that only comes about through the consequences of how you depict your characters and the situations. That's what I mean by narrativism.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely. So the notion that there have to be chapters, there have to be scenes, you have to use that kind of language, you conference about what's going to happen. Any of that stuff has nothing to do with anything I ever wrote about. So therefore, in a lot of ways, what you're talking about with depiction, I see as either a parallel or a productive. I mean, I always used to say, when I talked about purpose and play, what I used to call GNS, what we called creative agenda, any of that stuff, whenever we talked about that, I always said the person has to say it for themselves. They're never going to just adopt my language. They have to disagree, go home, think it over, and say, okay, I got it, you're wrong, I got it now. And then they say pretty much the same thing, but they're saying it for themselves. And so that particular detail, or that particular side of things, the depiction, I think let's pull it out to any purpose of play. Let's say that one of the elements of role-playing is that you're not going to achieve your purpose because somebody gave it to you. You can't have, for example, a competitive game where they hands the victory to you. That's it's contraindicatory. You can't do it. The same way, if you're interested in the excitement of enjoying and creating a story, you're not going to get it because the game makes stories. If the game makes stories, then it's by definition worthless for your purpose in doing that. Do you see what I mean? So only the depiction process you're talking about actually produces satisfactory results of play in terms of why we actually sat down to do this damn thing, whatever it may be. So that's one thing right there. So yes, I think your concept of depiction is very important. What I call that, of course, is system. That's by system, I mean anything we do at the table. I mean literally anything we do in order such that, whatever occurs in the fictional sense. So the depiction material I find very well put, but I also see it as pretty much, okay, this has been talked about and Dustin has done a good job of saying something that makes it work for him. I will, if you want to get terminological, depiction to me is a very static term, and to me still kind of leaves out the idea that what's being depicted is dynamic and has changes. You said in it that it includes the consequences, the causality of play, and that's what tips me off that we were talking about the same thing.
Oh, actually, no. Depiction for me is mostly just about the story trappings of the characters and the setting, and and the conflict. What's the crux of what you're doing.
Yeah. The word you want,
Um,
okay, in that case, what you're talking about is what I call situation.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
So
depiction sounds closer to situation.
right.
Um,
So,
uh,
okay, go ahead.
Immersion. My concept
Right.
of
Sorry.
immersion is
Yeah.
where causality
Right.
ties in.
I was referring to immersion, not to your term immersion, not to depiction. I didn't take very good notes as I was reading as I was listening. Let's dial it back. What you were calling immersion, and it's very, very typical, if you don't mind me saying, that people adopt
Mhm,
that term to mean whatever it is they consider very important. That term has been used for every damn thing under the sun in role playing. And the only thing I know when someone says the word immersion is to know that whatever it is they say next is going to be very important to them. And it's going to be
mhm.
totally different from the last time I heard it. So so that's fine. You, like everyone else, has grabbed the term immersion and made it your own, and then we look at what you mean. And there, I will say, is precisely the same thing as what I mean by system. Whatever it is we do with causality in it, with communication in it, with process in it, ritualization, routines, mechanics in it, that, for lack of a better word, makes things go.
Mhm.
And that has many different components. We can talk about resolution, which I actually consider to be a minor component. And we can talk about changes in the characters, which I consider to be a major component. But that's what I'm seeing when you use that word and you describe it. I say, okay, I know what he's talking about. I've used a term for the very same thing, and we are at least speaking the same language. And I think you're totally on the right track conceptually. The word I use for what you're doing is phenomenology. Actually, that word was dropped upon me by someone else who said, you're talking about phenomenology, and I said, oh, really? And and anyway, so yeah, it's not really saying how does this particular game work or what is role playing in a hobby sense, which game is real role playing and which game isn't. That's all bullshit. It's talking instead about what on earth do we do? What on earth
Mhm.
is this activity in its most basic raw form? And we know that there is a whole constellation of different ways and different angles and different purposes to take with it. Another thing I like to point out is that at this level, what we're creating, and you use the right word in here too, medium. That's really what we're talking about. What is the medium of which we make a thing when we do this?
Mhm.
And so, one thing that I didn't hear in your description that I think is very important is communication. And I mean
Mhm.
it specifically in terms of you take what you hear and what someone else is doing and saying, and you take that and you incorporate it, you internalize it into your imagination of what's going on, and it informs what you do next. I mean, the most simplistic sense, basically, the goblin pops up from the pit and takes a swing at you, and you say, oh, well, I block. And there you go. I mean, you're taking what they said and you are now making use of it. And that seems very simplistic, but it just gets more and more and more and more interesting and nuanced the more you do it, and the more it becomes that, like I say, it's like the oil and the paint and the canvas. It's stuff that we use together by which we're making a specific thing in a specific way this time.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess the way I look at it is the communication is the process by which things are understood.
Hmm.
Um, I would see like in that description of the goblin pops out of the pit and you like I take a block. I would see that being an interaction primarily focused on the concept of causality and agency.
Sure.
Like things
Absolutely.
happen
Yeah.
and things happen and then there's a result and then agency. I decide what to do
You
next.
got it. That's exactly
Um,
correct. I completely agree with you. And those terms are both terms I use in my discussions as well for just the
mhm.
same reason. But the point being that we couldn't have done any of that causality and agency if I hadn't understood or cared what you said.
Right.
And we couldn't have committed to what my character does next unless we are at least in some state of enjoying the imagined quality of it all.
Mhm.
And that's why, when it's the one thing that's sort of in common with all these different uses of the word immersion. Everybody is valuing the imagined part of it in some way, and then they struggle to figure out how that relates to everything else they want to say. Um, so far so good. I think what I'm hearing in your description of immersion is very, very much like what I call the medium. Sometimes I call it the shared imagined space. Sometimes I call it um, well, anyway, lately I've just been taken to calling it the medium of play and leaving it at that because I'm trying to get as neutral language as possible. Other people in the
Hmm.
past have called it exploration. In other words, they've taken what you're using for some other thing and they're calling this exploration. That's another word that gets thrown around a lot for whatever purpose people seem to want to put it to. Um,
Hmm.
anyway, so far so good. I mean, I guess I'm saying that, since no one owns these terms, there's no, textbook thereof. um I'm saying that I understand what you mean by the immersion term.
So I
um
think the thing I'm curious about is by the immersion term, I wasn't interested in just the media of the game. I was interested in what the media does for the experience.
Correct. And
Um,
that's again why system is part of this, because systems are different. And again, I'm not just talking about whether you use a D10 or a D20. I'm talking about the overall practices of what we do there. And
mhm,
but what's important is that once you do have a medium established, the purpose to which you at the table, and me at the table, and we at the table in my group, and you in your table at your group, whoever, the purposes to which you are putting it are experientially, they're synonymous with doing the medium in the first place. So
mhm.
I could say, this is a net and a volleyball and a sand lot, and somebody can say, and then I would say, okay, so then we take this medium and we use it for the purposes of playing volleyball. And somebody will look at me strangely and say, but that is volleyball. What else would you do with it? And my point is that in role playing, as with so many other things, one's enjoyment of the way you use the medium is so strong, it's often almost impossible even to conceive that someone else would be doing something entirely different and would not
Yeah,
enjoy what you do even a little. And
yeah.
that's on the basis of purpose, on the basis of what they hope to get out of it, and that purpose has its social qualities as well as its creative desires. And so you have so
So
that's, I
I
think,
guess I guess
right,
I'm really interested in using volleyball as an example to break down
right.
um, my concepts to try to dive into them a little deeper so we can see what
Okay,
what
I'll
it
hold on
was.
to that. I'll hold on to that, but I just wanted to get it across to you that to you, you were just saying about how your term immersion includes those purposes. And I would say, yes, it does. As an experience, it certainly does. But as a phenomenon,
Yeah.
they're very different. In other words, you can have a people get together and they fail at the medium, right? They fail at the medium. They can't communicate properly about it. They don't know how these pieces are supposed to interact. Have you ever seen somebody try to play synthesize and not quite get why this point goes with that point or how this die roll goes with this other thing? and
Yeah.
then and then also they have trouble listening to other people. That's one of the issues that comes up in a game where the depiction, in your terms, situation as I call it, doesn't click for someone. They have an awfully hard time, a terrible time, actually committing, to saying what their character does next. Or if maybe they're not very authentic in their interaction with the others and they're far more interested in looking like the expert or far more interested in being the funny guy, or they're just not comfortable with this group of people, or maybe there's some other problem going on, whatever it is that interferes, or maybe they just don't like the material. They sat down to play and they thought it was going to be cyberpunk, and they're playing synthesizer. They told them it was cyberpunk, or someone did, and they had something in their heads which is not synthesized. And I bet that's happened at least once.
Hmm.
And so they're expecting completely different. They're basically expecting superheroes and a lot of anime tropes and stuff like that. And so under these circumstances, the medium itself can break down because the communication for purposes of play is not successful. I mean, they will glumly pick up their die and roll when told, but that's not the same thing. And so that's what I'm saying. The medium in and of itself can be unsuccessful for a particular group. But
Right.
we can also say that the medium is everybody is entering into the medium with goodwill and good competence, but their purposes of play are very different. And this can be much more of an insidious problem because it's not so obvious out of the gate.
Right.
And so the other, after a while, I mean, whether it's more than one session or maybe it's right there in that session, who knows? Somebody's going to basically pretty much believe that that other person and these other people at the table simply don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't know, they don't get why you are properly here.
Hmm.
And I know I've experienced that when I am playing toward a particular, and with a purpose, I wouldn't even say in mind. I guess it is technically in mind because it's in my brain, but it doesn't feel like it's in mind. It feels very intuitive. It feels very automatic for what we're doing. And this other person next to me is just playing in a way where it just seems to completely not hear and undercut what I and maybe someone else at the table are doing this for. And
Hmm.
and then you can, you realize pretty soon if you're really reflective about this that they probably feel pretty much the same thing about you. And so that's what
Hmm.
I'm trying to get at, is that there is a difference between medium and purpose. And so
Right.
your use of the word immersion is very sensible to me when it's talking about the medium. And I understand that to you it includes the purpose and the sort of the aesthetic drive and the nature of what you're excited to be doing with these other people. I get that it includes it because experientially it does, but they are really two different things. Does that
Hmm.
make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Um, I guess to dive in further with what I meant, because sometimes as we're talking, I feel like there's deeper concepts that you see that you think I'm saying, and you might be right. I might be saying those, but me as being not as driven in this way of talking, I'm not sure that is what I'm saying.
hmm
And like for example, to break this down into volleyball example,
yeah, I was
for
interested.
me in the volleyball example, um, depiction would be the the court, the sand, the net, the
hmm
ball. That would be depiction. Even the rules of the game, like this is what we're supposed to do. This is what we're trying to accomplish. The structure of the conflict. That would all be depiction in my mind.
It's a little
Um,
tricky as an analogy because there's no imagined component.
right,
You
but
don't
I
have to,
mean,
yeah. But go on. But there are
yeah,
some very powerful parallels. Um,
so let's make the assumption that we're imagining a game. We're imagining a game of volleyball.
okay,
So imagining a game of volleyball, all the drive to represent the game is depiction,
right,
and then the immersion is the players' connection and belief that they are in that experience.
right. This is
That
something that I've talked about before quite a bit. And I think that is very good of you to talk about immersion as a result rather than an out of the gate, you know, phenomenon. One
right,
of and that's a really big deal for me, is saying that that we as a group can get this going, but there has to be sort of a return on our initial investment, our initial way of talking, our initial things of what we say, so that it's happening in play and we're not just staring at the startup material, perpetually.
right,
And so and I think I've been in games where that never happened. And even though we take it through all these adventures and all these things to do, imaginatively and creatively and emotionally, I never left that first sit down, look at my character sheet stage. It's still just a character sheet to me. And so I know what you mean. Yes, I think that it is. I do see the difference. Exactly how you're going to talk about depiction as a start and then an ongoing process, and immersion as an experiential, development of it, a stronger, more social, more communicative, aspect of all this. Um, and sort of deciding, that I kind of say it's kind of up to you to decide where rolling to hit fits.
mhm,
I tend to break things into real boring categories of real humans sitting at a table and using their voices and instruments like dice versus the imagined phenomena which can be talked about in strictly fictional terms if we cared to, as in, then this guy went here and then he did that and then this happened. I
Yes.
find it
So I
fairly useful to break it into those rather than try and mix and match both of those across my big categories.
yeah, I guess the way I would look at it is that I'm pulling back a bit from the actual event of saying what you do and roll the dice, because to me that's a way you chose to explore depiction and immersion. That's a way you chose to see the story and a way to adjudicate the agency and of the player. And I feel like
I agree that's what it is completely.
Yeah.
But
So
it's a part and parcel of the agency and adjudication, because again, speaking at the pure level of just making the fiction in operation. So the word story is very toxic here. I don't mean make a story in that sense, in that literary sense. I mean simply that the fiction occurs and continues to go. In that circumstance, if we're talking about agency and adjudication, if we didn't have any such thing, and instead all we do is sit around and we're just going to agree about what happens next, and we're just going to agree about how it turns out, and we'll just conference our way through it, right? And that's all we're going to do. People have tried making stories or fiction or whatever that way for millennia, and it's a disaster every single time. It doesn't work. And insofar as it produces, any kind of fiction, it ain't fun, and it's not fun to do, and it's not fun to enjoy. And the stories that are made, if we're talking about stories, tend to suck. So the thing I'm trying to say is that the agency and adjudication you're talking about are actually very, very meaty components of their success. This is where I broke long, long ago with people who claimed that more powerful stories and role-playing come when you turn away from mechanics like that. People brag, we played for 4 hours and we never touched the dice once, that kind of thing. And my argument.
But see, this is where I might disagree, because I feel like there's still, if they play for 4 hours and don't touch the dice once, I feel like there's still an element of adjudication going on, which
you're agreeing with me, because that is my next step, which we've hashed out before years ago, which was that I would turn to them and say, okay, so what did you do? And if they tell me what they did, it's very hard for people to reflect upon what they did. They might even claim that all they did was just agree their way through or whatever, but you will find that they were using rules of engagement for who talks when and about what that are often quite sophisticated and very consistent through the use of their time. So I completely agree. So those, to me, it's like I said, there are game designs in which a good way to look at it is that the other people are organizing the way they talk in such a way that they become your dice. And that's fine. That counts for exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, as I was trying to be careful to explain, was story conferencing, where there isn't any adjudication except for a seeking of consensus at every single step. Usually that turns into one person bullying everybody else.
Right.
And it also turns
I feel like, one of the things that I included in my concept of immersion as I was trying to write this down is this concept of believability.
Right.
And I feel like, if you and the believability is trying to capture the idea of the game and the story's internal logic that can be learned and interacted with. And
that's a tricky topic for a lot of people in all media.
Yeah, it is.
So I don't know if we're ever going to really get to the heart of that ourselves.
But I feel like when a lot of these people are telling stories, without touching dice, and they're agreeing what happens next, I feel like they are looking at the agency of what people choose to do, and then consulting their concept of believability. Well, what would happen? What's a reasonable result as of what you chose to do?
Well,
and
if that has certain other properties, I think it can be quite functional. But I am talking about times when there are no other properties except the seeking of consensus, and I'm claiming that such play breaks down very rapidly and is a failure of the
Mhm.
medium typically.
Yeah, I
The
guess I've never experienced pure consensus storytelling.
Yeah.
I
Well, I
feel
don't
like
think anyone ever has. People have idealized it and they've claimed they've done it, or they've claimed that they would do it, or that pure role playing would be it. In other words, I've brought it up perhaps as an irrelevant topic for us specifically, but only as the negative, only in order to say that the kind of adjudicated agency through whatever means, including social and verbal, is necessary for this medium we're talking about, or for your immersion even to function at all. And
Mhm.
the and just to stick with this for a sec, if we're talking about primarily verbal methods of play without probabilistic devices, then one principle that really seemed to have served a lot of people well is the notion that it's very boring to make up the adversity that then you yourself come up with a solution for. That typically it's a lot of fun to have to cope. If you have a lot of freedom to say what you want, it's really fun not to have the freedom to say what happens to you. If you have a lot of
Mhm.
freedom to say what happens to somebody, it's a lot of fun not to be the person who's then responsible for saying how they deal with it and how they overcome it or fail to. In other words, it's good to keep trading off those roles among us, and then everything seems to pop and snap and be a little more unpredictable. That's what I mean by everybody being everybody else's dice. But the
Mhm.
speaking has to be organized in such a way that this occurs. And that is there's a whole family of game design, of role playing design, that does this, which is awesome. But but anyway, I think that's just sort of underlining my point that we do have a genuine need for these processes of adjudication, processes of communication, processes of what I like to call the authorities or responsibilities that really are necessary. It's a lot. I keep analogizing. Another thing I say is, I can't say let's play cards and slap down a deck, and everybody says how do you play, and you say, well, I don't know. Let's just agree as we go along. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But that is what a certain idealization of role playing would have us believe about the let's clean up the medium of all these silly wargamer leftovers, is kind of the idea. And I think that's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
and I think the thing that's funny about that is, like, using your example, if everyone were to sit down with a deck of cards and make it up as they went along, they might come up with new, novel, unique ways to do things, but the majority of what they will do will be using conventions they already experienced in other
Right.
structured games.
Right. That's another interesting point. I mean, insofar as they make it happen at all, they will just start doing a game. And so but the idea that you would never come up with rules, that you would just agree as you go as the rule, that to me is a complete failure of
Yeah,
conception. So
yeah,
anyway, all that said, that was a lot of time just to underscore that particular point of the importance. That's why I think that things like how we roll the dice and whatnot, they're not important at this level in terms of the particular way, but they are important as phenomena, that we are doing any such thing. You know,
hmm
that's kind of that. So I actually think they're pretty strongly embedded in what you're calling immersion, um,
hmm
because of that. So that's just sort of my take on that side of it. The part that Okay, first of all, do you feel as though I've stepped on anything you've said, because I was trying to match parts of what you were saying that I find very familiar. I was trying to match up with stuff that I've said and add a couple of wrinkles here and there, and that's all I was trying
yeah,
to do so far. So
yeah.
you
No,
think I've done okay with that, or?
yeah. I think you have. I think when we first started, I think there were some sort of deeper, more detailed concepts about the structure of games that you were touching on that I wasn't sure I was
Hmm.
intending to touch on. But then when we kind of went with just the volleyball example, I felt
Right.
more in line with
Yeah.
what you were saying.
That sounds good.
Uh,
Okay, so that's good. I mean, I'm recording this, so we can go back and revisit that sort of murkier part in earlier if we want to, later.
Okay.
But and
Um,
it may have been just a complete like non-starter. Who knows? But then we can go to the part that I said, okay, well, this is the part that sounds a little bit more uh, unfamiliar to me. This is the part where I'm really, really interested in the unique nature of the perspective, the unique nature of the contribution. This is the part where I want Dustin to explain it to me better. And it is, so I get it. And that's the digestion part.
right.
So talk
And
to me a little more about that.
yes, so digestion is it's an act on the player's side that then is tied to and influenced by the 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 structure and elements of the game side.
Right.
So it's not a concept of how the game is built or a concept of how the players act. It's a concept of something the players do in response to how the game is.
Yes.
And digestion is just this idea of absorbing and deriving mental enjoyment from a game and its world.
Perfect. This is the heart of. I'll include this diagram, I guess, in the video, or the recording. But this is precisely where I begin. So now I see what you're saying, and I don't mean to step on more of what you have to say because I'm open to you saying more. I just want to jump in here though and say this is precisely where I begin my consulting sessions with people. I say you're going to be starting with some kind of imagined material and some kind of instrumentation. You're going to be, but it's static at the moment. I'm just looking maybe at the depiction on a cover, or I'm looking at my options for player characters, or I'm looking at, what the rules say my first contribution will be. I'm looking at, just the beginnings of saying, am I going to enjoy this, and having some idea of what that this might be. So I'm at that stage. Well, we have to take it through play. And after that, the question is, did I like it? And that's related to what happened. And I'm specifically going to point, this is something that I think is consistent with your use of the word digestion. And it's the heart of everything I talk about, which is something has to change. Something about the fictional content has to change. And therefore, the character, the most obvious one in all kinds of role playing is that your character bites the dust. Others are much more along the lines of, my character is injured and then recovered, or my character made lots of money, or, we saved the princess or didn't save the princess. We met a guy and the guy turned out to be really cool. We had a negotiation and it turned out this way. My character got more powerful, right? I got these rewards and this system stuff, and I got more powerful. Whatever they may be, and there are obviously hundreds and hundreds. We could be talking about very fictional. You could use very fictional language, or you could use very systemic language. It doesn't matter. But something changes. And it's when those things happen that I think, without realizing it at a verbal level, people say, well, if this is what changes, did I like it? I put some investment into this. I put time into this. I listened to people. I spoke. I made choices. I was cognitively and emotionally engaged to whatever extent. And now the question is, look at what changed in the fiction. Was that any fun? And I can tell you, sometimes to me, I say that wasn't worth it. All that we went through, and each of us got one experience point, and nothing seemed to change in the situation except what the GM said changes. And, and to try as we might, we couldn't have an impact that I could see actually occur. And I can't see any of the things that occurred actually coming back to me as a player or anybody here in any particular way. And therefore, no, I'm really not sure that all that was worth it. I put it in, and another time I might say, um, that was amazing. Look at all that happened. And even if the changes we made were minor, I really felt as though we made them. and I can see it. I marked it here. There's that mark on my character sheet right there. That is the change that, that I remember how that change came about. It was because of these
Yeah,
things.
and I feel like that concept of change would be what I see as immersion, and then your satisfaction and receptiveness to that change
Hmm.
would be what I see as digestion.
Perfect. I completely get you in this because that digestion is completely. Oh, there's so many things to say about it. First of all aspects of game design are moot unless that is understood as their basic mechanical purpose. Because I talk to people once we talk about this in these languages, and right when they're saying yeah, and I say, well, would people come back and play again? Whether this is a game where the fiction can go on so that they'll play a continuation, or maybe it's ended, it came to its end point here in this session, but they would do it again, one of these days with enthusiasm. They'll tell they might maybe they'll never do it again, but they're going to make it their business to tell other people that they should try this thing. All of those are agains of different kinds, and it's when you see the agains, the recommendation to do it, the desire to do it again, whatever. Whenever you see that, you know that the digestion, as you're calling it, what I call reward, in a kind of, I guess, overly behaviorist sense, but I didn't mean it that way. I just mean reward because it feels rewarding. And the the notion that, how am I going to put it? Another way I like to put it sometimes as a joke is system is a way that a character sheet becomes another character sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you could apply that to anything besides character sheets. That's just an example. But the notion is that given that, okay, you can quite rightly and properly, you very well should say, and was that fun? And did is the changes themselves and the nature of the processes we used and the metrics, if any, and whatever it is involved with that, are those freaking fun at the most basic human level? And there's some, that's where those goals come in. You talked about in your immersion, the sort of the goals of play to some extent. And then I picked up on that myself when I talked about goals. And and that's where these get assessed. They don't get, you talked about, you're not talking about trying to make a story. I agree. We're never talking about trying to make a story. You sit down and say, I'm going to try to make a story, you're not going to do it. That's why people get writer's block. It's a ridiculous mental state to be in. And instead, the question is whether we are here to do this, and whether our instrumentation and our interactions are sufficient toward that end. And that's all. So but the point being that there are different purposes. So when people say, did I have fun? It is usually not some sort of generic, I don't think it will ever be just some sort of generic fun with no identity. They will have had fun in ways that humans have fun when they get together. And there are lots of different ways humans do that. And so that's sort of my take on your digestion. At first, I thought you were talking about something kind of whacked and different from anything I'd ever talked about, but now I see that we actually are still, if you don't mind me saying, very much on the same page. I
Right, and
think you're going to
I
have an
think,
interesting time, like teasing apart. I don't know if you even want to, but if you do try to tease apart what these categories you're talking about, you may find some difficulty or having to pull pieces of the pieces apart in order to, kind of categorize or look at the way this functions. I have my own sort of anatomy and
yeah,
physiology of how I
yeah,
think it happens, but you sound like you're still working that out.
yeah. I am still working it out, and I feel like these are basically primary funnels, and
Right,
inside those funnels are discrete elements that could be
right.
categorized on their own.
Yeah.
Um,
You're right on the right
so
track. This is big model talk, as we called it at the Forge, and I really, really like it.
yeah,
I don't know if you've seen my videos, the Phenomenology videos that I have at Adept Play.
no, I have
But
not.
if you do, and they're not intended to say, well, okay, nice try, Dustin, here's the real thing. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it is valuable for more than one person to be threshing through this independently.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and once having done that to a certain extent, then it is valuable to encounter somebody else who's doing it with a goodwill. And believe me, finding people who are doing this in good faith and not grinding an axe is really fucking hard. And so, therefore, I think that I would really welcome you seeing what I did, not for purposes of correcting you or anything like that, but for purposes of enriching the way both of us are thinking about it.
Hmm.
Because I'm interested in what you would say after. You know what I mean? Or you would say, okay,
Yeah.
well, in my construction, it would work like this. And I would say, that is an awesome construction. That sort of thing.
Based on this conversation, I feel like I would boil down my ideas even further, because as we talked and you started diving into all these related concepts, I sort of realized that there were, I wasn't as far down the funnel as I want to be, because I was connecting to specific
Right.
Game elements trying to explain them. So I felt like my ideas weren't big enough. Actually, the more we talked,
Believe me, I know what you mean. That's why I might have seen that mine were getting a little abstract there for a second, because we are talking at these fairly abstract levels. I mean, you want to talk about life, you got to talk about metabolism. You don't feel
yeah,
your own metabolism, do you?
no,
You feel your limbs, you feel your sensations, you feel your urges and things, and you think thoughts, but you don't like experience your own metabolism. Talking about role playing in the same way, at that phenomenological level, really is a little mind blowing. And sometimes I feel like the best thing to do is to like get back in the murky soup and just talk about how we roll dice once in a while, just so we stay real. But yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying about. I hope
hmm
I hope it was interesting. I hope what I talked about was interesting. Leads you to
yeah.
more. Yeah.
So I sent you a note, and I feel like if I was going to redefine my three elements
Uh huh.
to be less loaded, because my idea of depiction was slightly loaded with the concept of story.
Mm-hmm.
My idea of immersion was slightly loaded with the concept of systematic causality,
Mm-hmm.
and then my idea of digestion was loaded with your level of system detail that you desire.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah, I
I,
thought you went off on that for a while, and I was thinking, well, that's kind of a weird part of all that, but that's cool. Yeah, go on.
yeah, I feel like maybe I would move up to a higher level, because I feel like those are still discrete elements
I
rather
agree.
than bigger
I
pictures.
completely agree.
I feel like maybe a better way to put it would be observation instead of depiction.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of being plugged into something
Right.
and what it is,
Right.
and then participation instead of immersion.
That's
The idea,
beautiful. My God, that
yeah,
is beautiful. I totally love that. Go on.
yeah, and the idea of interacting with it, and then reflection instead of
Right.
digestion.
Man. Okay, this is fantastic. I got to stop this here, or you got to leave, but we should stop this here, and I'll make the recording, the voice recording, because you're invisible. I'm
Sorry.
gonna. That's all right. I'll make the voice recording into a post at Adept Play, and um, and you can like maybe attach, send me the document, right? That if you want to scribble, and I'll attach it. And believe me, there's a really, really dedicated and thoughtful group of people, very constructive people, who will love to jump in on this.
Hmm.
And at some point, along this process, take a look at my little phenomenology videos and see if they, you know, see if you say, oh well, shit, Ron almost has it. Look at him. Oh, he makes a mistake right there. That's not right. And then you say what you think, is going on with what I'm saying. Because this is the kind of dialogues that I set up that whole seminar section at Adept Play to do. Um, I also think you'll get off on my system diagram techniques, because pretty soon, once we kind of get a grip on this phenomenological level, it's only sensible to then say, well, then, okay, how does a more specific anatomy work when we actually play this time with this group, with these people? Then,
Hmm.
because that's, once we kind of clear the air about the phenomenology, we can leave all that shit behind. We can kind of say, okay, the big noise has been made. The big things have been thunk, and they're really kind of basic once we hammer them out. It's not really After that point, I call it a door. You know, you at first for the longest time talking about things like the medium and the immersion and the reward and the fun and the reflection, all that seems like so problematic and so tough, and we're never going to get to the bottom of it, and so hard. And every time I try to talk about it with people, they argue and argue in the dumbest way, and I get so tired. And then all of a sudden you kind of say, but wait, now that I'm fairly satisfied with this and finding that like-minded people and I are, talking pretty much the same language about it, I don't really fucking care anymore. Now I want to talk about how this game works because all that stuff is no longer problematic for me.
Mm.
And it's really interesting. I've found that part of my efforts online have been to keep people from being stuck in that door. Because it's kind of like staying in graduate school for the rest of your life.
Right.
You kind of say,
Which
look,
some people
you
do.
wrote your goddamn dissertation and I thought it was pretty good. Get out of there. Get out of there. Start doing something now. It sounds to me as though you're past that point right now. And I think that's really cool.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, great. I got to run. What I'm going to do is later today or tonight, I'll write just a couple short paragraphs about my model going in, the way I saw things going into the conversation, and then a couple short paragraphs about the way I saw things leaving the conversation.
That's really exciting.
And
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can attach that to the video.
Perfect. Dustin, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later on.
All right, great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.